Hi, my name's Will, and I'm a Java developer, and I also have been doing a lot of work with Unity lately. In today's video, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to use visual page designers with Spring Boot. If you have used anything like Thymeleaf, if you're interested in how to build a web app really fast using a visual builder tool, if you're a Java developer that wants to be able to make a nice looking web page, but you're a little overwhelmed by writing lots of, say, Bootstrap and Tailwind CSS by hand. I think that you'll find this video pretty interesting. What I'm going to do is show you how to use Pinegrow, which is a visual web page editor, with Spring Boot, and Thymeleaf, which is the de facto standard for doing web page development with Spring Boot. A lot of my other videos, sometimes they run a little long. I'm going to try to keep this one short and focused. So I'm not going to get into the details around how Spring works and stuff like Thymeleaf and Spring security in depth. Mostly this is just a real short video to show you that you can use in 2022 a visual web page builder to build really nice looking Spring Boot apps. Okay, so first of all, just to kind of set up as a basic introduction, I'm going to start by just showing you what Thymeleaf is, if you aren't familiar with it. Thymeleaf is a Java-based template engine for making web pages. And the big feature that Thymeleaf has that I think personally is very neat is that you can use Thymeleaf to build what are called natural templates. And what that means is that when you're working with Thymeleaf, you're just writing HTML. And then when you want to actually make the page add a value that's dynamic, what you do is you mostly work with attributes. So this is an example right here. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. And what you'll see here is here's a little chunk of HTML. And you see it's got a table tag and it's got its header. And you'll notice that it's got on the header, it says name and price. But then it's also got this THText attribute. So the way Thymeleaf works is that when you actually run this page, the controller will inject a value, and then it will replace the value here with the text. So for example, here it's looping through, and this is going to be all products, and then it will loop through and replace each one of these rows with another row for every product, and then it will go ahead and add in the attribute for the name that's live. But you'll notice that here I've just got oranges. And so oranges is basically the default. So if I take a Thymeleaf page and I open it up in my browser, or I can open it up with a visual editor, I'll see a really nice preview of what my page is going to look like. So by fusing these pieces together, it means that it's really easy to get a mock-up. You can send the mock-up up to a client. You can maybe, if you're working with a designer that likes to work in HTML and do fancy CSS stuff. And then you, as the Java developer, can just go ahead and add in these extra HTML attributes for the dynamic parts. So it's a really nice way of doing work. Just to quickly compare that with another framework like PHP, PHP would add special little tags into it that are not HTML. And so then that would make the page look more janky when you try to view it in a browser, or if you are working with it with a visual designer. The only way to really preview what an HTML page in PHP is to actually run it through the PHP interpreter to be able to view it. So visual editors. So really quickly, just to kind of give you some background, back in the day there were a lot of visual editors for HTML, and that was when pages were mostly classic request response. So imagine like it's the late 90s, early 2000s, someone wants to build a website. Most of the time the way those sites would work is that it would just be strictly, here's a form, click submit, and then the whole page would refresh and come back. That was great for a long time, but then what happened was people started thinking about more modern web apps where portions of the page would update as you would work with it. Most Java developers today are going to then switch over to something where the Java developer is just going to write REST services that send back JSON, and then that JSON would get parsed and rendered, and things like these templates would be written and running inside the context of something like an Angular app or a React app or Svelte or something like that. What's kind of cool about Thymeleaf is that if you use Thymeleaf with something like HTMX, you can actually replace fragments of the page very easily. Again, you're just adding little attributes to the page with HTMX or Alpine.js or HyperScript or something like that. So then you get interactivity, again, just by adding in little attributes on the page, and then it knows to refresh, and then you get nested templates, which is really cool. Then you can say, write portions of your page in HTML, and then you can then stick them all together into a main page. And Thymeleaf works perfectly with that. Thymeleaf lets you say, hey, here's just a fragment of HTML. I want to go back to dynamically swapping the page. And also has things like layouts. So you can say on the server, you want to go ahead and do includes as well. So it all works really nicely. And again, this is all stuff that we could spend a long time going through, but in the interest of time, I just want to focus on how does this work with a visual page designer and Spring Boot specifically. So let's go ahead and look at a very standard Spring Boot app that I've got. Here is a Spring Boot app that I've got. And basically it's just a project I have up on GitHub, so you're welcome to go ahead and download it. And if we look at it, we'll see I've got my standard Spring Boot things. I've got a controller that's sending some information back. I'm querying a little bit of data. I've got a security configuration, and this particular demo I'm using Supabase in order to manage the persistence. That's again a big topic. Supabase is basically a hosted open source Postgres environment that also includes a lot of things like auth services and stuff. So it's a little bit like a more open source version of Firebase, but none of that really matters for this video. The important thing is that it's just a Spring Boot app. It's got Maven for its build system, just pretty straightforward stuff. So now the part that's interesting is to instead start looking at our web pages. So this is our resources folder, and in here I've got a public directory, which is all the things like icons and HTML. Now before we go any further, let's just go ahead and run the app so we can see what this thing actually looks like. So what I'm doing here is I'm just launching a Spring Boot app. And let's go ahead and bring it up in my browser. And so in this app, let's go ahead and make it a little bigger. All it is just a simple page with a profile, and I can log in. Here I've logged in with my GitHub account. I can sign out. I can sign back in again. I could use an email and a password. I could register. I can do Remember Me. But for the purpose of this, I'm just going to go ahead and click Sign In with GitHub. And since I've already approved the auth, it just goes and auths me back, and now I'm logged in. So the important thing here isn't the details about how the auth works or the persistence. That's all related to Supabase, which is another video. In this one, what we're looking at is this HTML page. And so specifically, I've only got a couple of pages here. I've got the sign-in page, I've got the profile page. The profile page is just giving me some information about me and my email address and whatever. Pretty straightforward stuff. So I could edit this page all inside of a IDE like IntelliJ. So let's go back and look here. I've got my index page, I've got a layout, and I've got secure. So secure, this is just a demo of a page that is behind the security and identity stuff. And here you can see I've got my user object that I'm injecting into the page, and I've got just some regular HTML. So I could edit it, I could open it up in another IDE if I wanted to work with Visual Studio or Code or Nova to edit my HTML or whatever I might want to do. And I could go in here and I could start adding in styling by hand. But that would require that I would have to remember all of the styling configuration. So in this case I'm using Bootstrap, so I would have to go in and remember all the Bootstrap classes for everything by hand and work just by typing. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're living in HTML and CSS all day long and you just remember every single command. But if you don't, then that's where something like a visual designer tool comes in. Pinegrow is a kind of a modern version of something in the past, like Dreamweaver or something, but it's been built from the ground up to be native for modern 2022 work. So what that means is that it has Chrome embedded, so when you're working with it, what you're seeing is actually what Chrome would do. And then they've got support for all the modern things like CSS and Sass and grids and all that fun stuff. In addition, it also supports things like Bootstrap and Tailwind CSS. And we'll look at more at what it does in just a sec. So let's just go ahead and open up Pinegrow. And actually, I'm going to go ahead. So let's go ahead and open up Pinegrow. And let's go ahead and open up the project here. So what I've done is I go into my source directory, main resources public, and that's where I'm putting all the assets here. So I've got my HTML files, I've got my CSS and everything. And when I hit open, then I just click on a file, and it loads the file for me, and I can start working with it visually. This is nice because I can do things like hit keyboard shortcuts to switch to the different sizes. So for example, here this is a 1440, and it's actually scaling it to fit into the smaller view. I can say here is 1024, 640. I can go ahead and look at different sizes, and then I can go ahead and start clicking on elements here. So over here I've got the hierarchy of everything, of all the HTML. And over here I can start applying formatting and things. So let's just take something really obvious. So I've just got this paragraph that says welcome. Now let's say that I wanted to apply some styling to this. Now there's a lot of ways I can do that, and I don't want to get into all of the nitty-gritty about CSS and styling, but most of the time when you're working with something like Bootstrap, you're just applying classes to things, right? So over here, you'll notice I've got now a Bootstrap specific set of formatting capabilities that I can apply. And that includes things like, if you see up here, it's a little small, the XS small, MD, LG. This is the sizing stuff that controls whether or not elements appear depending on what size of the screen it is. That's the kind of stuff that gets very confusing when you're working with it just in code. Like, is this element here? Is it not displaying? What is my design really doing? So I've opened up my project now in Pinegrow, and I can see I've got my index page here, which you probably recognize from before. I've got a layout page here, which let's go ahead and make that bigger. This is the profile that we were looking at, and then I have a layout view, really. This is a Thymeleaf layout. And this is showing how I've got my header, my footer, and my identity stuff all handled here. And then I've got this page content goes here. And this is a great example if I bring up the code editor for this element. So here I can see if I just take this one element and I select the wrapper for it, and then I bring up the editor, the code editor. So I'm just looking at this one chunk of code. I can see this layout fragment content. That's a chunk coming from Thymeleaf. And this shows how I'm able to add these attributes here and then still have perfectly valid HTML, but then have things get controlled when it gets processed and executed. Now, you may quibble and you may say, well, layout fragment isn't straight HTML. You can actually add data attributes to most of these things if you want perfect HTML validation, if you want to take that to the next level. That said, most browsers don't seem to have a issue with that stuff. It just ignores attributes it doesn't recognize. Okay, so we've got this visual editor here. We can click around, we can put formatting on things, we can change stuff. Let's go ahead and go back into this page here. I could make this bright orange. I can make it, transform it. Let's go ahead and make it bigger. We can do all sorts of fun stuff. So this is all Bootstrap stuff. And if we actually look at this, we can actually look at the code for this. You can actually see it's applying Bootstrap classes and as it's doing this formatting. So it is doing the right thing in terms of now I'm working with Bootstrap, and it's applying these styles and layouts and things the correct way. Now, let's say that you're not a Bootstrap person. You can either work with just straight CSS, HTML, you can work with Sass. If we go into Pinegrow and we go to Manage Libraries and Plugins, we can actually see all the different things that are supported by Pinegrow. So we can see Bootstrap. I've got Bootstrap 5 activated. If I preferred, I could have Tailwind. I've got an SVG library set up here, and I've also got something called Bootstrap Blocks. Let's take a quick look at Bootstrap Blocks. So Bootstrap Blocks lets me take pretty large and complex chunks and just drag and drop them straight in. So if let's say that my goal is to build, I've got my regular header navs, and then maybe I want to put a call to action in. Oh, here we go. Here's the call to actions. And I can drop one of those into the page. And so here you can see I can very quickly start building my page and then adding in attributes with Thymeleaf, and then I can go back into my site and refresh it. So let's take this one here. So I just added this. This is just the most standard marketing type thing ever, and I just dragged and dropped it into the page. So now let's go ahead and go back to the browser and look at our home page. And you'll note that when I hit refresh, it doesn't automatically show that. And that's because Spring Boot's dev tools don't want to actually pick up the change until I do a refresh of some kind. So the easiest way to do that is to just go in and hit build inside of IntelliJ real quick. and then it'll take it just a second or two, and then I can hit refresh, and now I can see the page. And oh, that's because that section didn't go inside the right container. So cool. Now I just move that into below the welcome. And so what's happening there is that because I dropped it in outside of the container for the content, it thought that this should be part of the footer that would get chopped off by the Thymeleaf layout. So go ahead and hit save, hit build, and then go back into my browser and hit refresh, and there's my content showing up. So yeah, so you can see how much quicker it is to work with adding in content to the page, drag and drop. I can use CSS to lay things out. It's just a lot faster and quicker and easier to work. So what we want to do now is just look at the small tweaks that you need to make to a Spring Boot project to be able to work with a visual designer, because it doesn't work out of the box. So there are a couple of things to change to get Spring Boot to work with Pinegrow. The main thing is that in a Spring Boot project by default, what it's going to do is it's not going to look for the HTML templates inside of this resources public directory. And the key is you want all your resources to live in the same directory. Instead, what it does is they create a separate templates folder. And so by default, it will load the templates from a different directory, and then all the assets like the CSS and the images will come from a different directory. Now, the reason that it does that is that back in the day, bad old day of stuff like Dreamweaver, often you'd put pretty interestingly, potentially very sensitive information in your HTML. For example, the worst one being some of the Dreamweaver stuff, they'd actually put things like JDBC connection information right into the JSP page, which is a terrible idea. With Thymeleaf, or frankly with any modern web development, you don't want to put anything in the template that you wouldn't be sending to the user anyways. What that means is that you really ought to be working with HTML templates that if the template got out, you would be okay. Maybe you don't want to do that by default, and we'll talk about that more in a second, but you definitely don't want to put anything that's secure into a template file. So in order to tell Spring that you want to load the templates from the same folder, you have to override the default configuration in the file. And specifically what you need to do is set a Spring Thymeleaf prefix class path public. That's all you have to do to add to your Spring Boot project to tell it to load the templates from the same directory as the other assets. Everything else will then just work. Now, what you want to do next is when you're working with Pinegrow, it's going to drop some files that you also don't want to put into your project. That includes the backup files by default go in the same directory, and then also some of the additional information that Pinegrow uses. For those things, what you want to do is you want to tell Maven to not copy those into the application. And the easiest way to do that is to go into your POM file and add a resources block. And so here we can see that this is a resources block, and we're just saying that when this resources directory, we want to exclude those Pinegrow files. The identity is a separate one that has to do with Supabase, and that's another video. So we want to add an entry to the application YAML to tell Thymeleaf to load the correct directory that's the same as the rest of the asset. We want to exclude some of those from Maven's packaging. And then the only other thing that I would recommend doing is going ahead and inside of your Spring security configuration, just to be secure, I would go ahead and add in a blocker as well that says, hey, don't send HTML files. So what this is doing is it's saying that if the web application, if somebody asks for a .html file, just deny it. And that's another aspect of the security. Again, you shouldn't be putting anything in the HTML templates that you should care if it went out, because it's just HTML, right? But if you're concerned about it, go ahead and add this to your security configuration. Of course, the other thing is you probably want to add a bunch of those Pinegrow files to your GitHub ignore file. So we'll go ahead and we'll just look at the ignore real quick just so you can see what I put in for that. And that's basically the Pinegrow backup folders. That's about it. There's really not too much more to it than that. You just want to make sure that you've set it up to point at this public directory, and then that's the directory that you'll open up in the Visual Editor tool. That's about all there is to it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope this is inspiring you to make your own web applications with Java. So that's all you have to do to add support for visual web page editing to your Spring Boot project. It's just a couple of configuration settings. Pinegrow's been great, and then I'm using that in conjunction with HTMX to be able to do swaps for subcomponents on the page, which makes it feel like a really fast, light, easy thing. So I don't really mess around with stuff like complicated web frameworks to build these really rich apps. And I can send back JSON data if I want to other apps, but if I'm just building a web application, this works really fast and really easy. I hope you liked the video. If you want to see any more videos about modern Java and other topics like Unity and stuff like that, just go ahead and hit subscribe, and you'll get to find out when I get the next video out. Take care. Bye-bye.